If life has a meaning and a promise, it's the concern that the world to come will be more free than the world in which we were born.
How did you go from forming the Tupamaros National Liberation Movement to becoming the president of Uruguay? Why do they say you were the poorest president in the world? What were the illnesses that ended up weakening you at the end of your life? Who was by your side during your last hours? In this report, we'll discuss that and many other topics. Latin America has presidents who have forever marked their countries and the entire region. Many stand out for controversial issues, scandals, or suspicions against them, but there was one who stood out from the rest. As president of Uruguay, he maintained a low profile and focused on the well-being of his people. He knew how to fight for his beliefs, even in the face of harsh consequences. A simple man, though tough and persistent, who fought as hard as he could against the disease that afflicted him. To grasp this tale of struggle, idealism, and humility, we must return to May 13th, 2025. The day he died, Pepe Mujica. Do you know everything Pepe Mujica did for Uruguay during his time as president? What do you associate with Pepe Mujica? What is the first thing that comes to mind when his name is mentioned? I read your comments and now let's get started. Although he became an example of honesty, Mujica could not escape health problems. His physical deterioration began in 2004, but the worst news came in April 2024. At a press conference, he announced that during a routine checkup, he had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer. The news set off alarms, but he remained calm. He vowed to remain politically active and work on his farm as long as his body allowed. In the following months, Mujica underwent radiation therapy. Being an 88-year-old person, the process was slower. There were no major updates until August of that year. His doctor, Raquel Panone, said that the cancer had been cured. As she added, recent scans did not show signs of the presence of tumors. However, she said his condition remained delicate due to the remaining esophageal fibrosis. Mujica's public appearances gave his followers hope. In November 2024, he celebrated the victory of left-wing presidential candidate Yamandu Orsi. An image of the former president dancing among the people even went viral. But the illusions vanished on Thursday, January 9, 2025. During an interview with the Uruguayan media outlet Búsqueda, Mujica said that the cancer had spread and his body could no longer withstand any more treatments or surgeries. Did he say his typical phrase, "I've come this far"? That revelation began the end, but let's not jump ahead. Instead, let's start from the beginning. Long before the militancy, mandate, and adventures, José Alberto Mujica Cordona was born on May 20th, 1935 in Paso de la Arena, a rural area west of Montevideo, Uruguay. Politics was always in his DNA. His father, Demetrio Mujica Terra, was of Basque descent, with a long history in European politics and on Uruguayan soil. But little Pepe had his maternal grandfather, Angel Cordano, as a direct role model. He was a supporter of the National Party, the oldest in all of Latin America. In fact, he was once a councilman in Colonia and was a close friend of Luis Alberto de Herrera, an intellectual and the first leader of the party. Thus, the young boy firsthand experienced that initiative which defended democratic values and the country's sovereignty. In those early years, Pepe also knew what it was like to struggle, especially when difficulties piled up. Pepe's father owned a ranch that went bankrupt. He passed away when Pepe was only 6 years old. Leonardo's mother, Lucy Cordano, took care of him and his sister, enabling him to finish primary and secondary school. As a teenager, Pepe developed a passion for reading, often spending hours at the public library. Literature enriched him, but that didn't stop him from also leaning towards sports. He practiced cycling, representing various clubs in different categories, but above all, he felt an affinity for rural life. He loved working the land. Like his father, he was a peasant and very proud of it. After completing his studies, he joined the Alfredo Vázquez Acevedo Institute to study law but did not complete the degree. His interest in politics had intensified over the years, and he was ready to dive into that world, even if there were terrible consequences. Mujica had already learned about politics from his family and met a key figure in his early days through his mother. Enrique Erro, a journalist who worked for left-leaning newspapers and had become a congressman. Thanks to him, he started working with the National Party. His commitment was evident from the first minute, and he was soon promoted to General Secretary of the Youth. Mujica formed a deep bond with Ero. In the 1958 elections, the deputy became the Minister of Labor. He brought the young man, who became his right-hand man despite not having an official role. In 1962, Mujica left the National Party and founded the New Popular Union group with Ero. Mujica. He was still too young to aspire to the presidential position, so the candidacy corresponded to Emilio Frugoni. His performance was discreet. Within years, Mujica built a political career while working on his family's farm. But he was discontented with the direction of the country. He knew that during the 40s, Uruguay used to be a prosperous country, known as the Switzerland of America. An ideal that ended with the end of the Second World War. As European countries were able to recover, it was necessary to sell cheaper and buy more expensive. This change in dynamics dismembered the country. It had been governed for 90 years by the Colorado Party, the most important political force, but the paradigm shift made it wobble. Inequality was constant. For Mujica and his young compatriots, a coup d'etat was inevitable. They believed that a general strike would not be enough, that it was necessary to resort to armed struggle. Always ready to join in 1963, he joined an organization that was taking shape and included followers of Maoism, socialism, and anarchism. It was an initiative that wanted to oppose the clashes between left-wing and far-right groups, although without aligning with any political party. The main influence came from the Cuban Revolution. 2 years later, the group presented itself with its official name, National Liberation Movement, Tupamaros. Mujica and other members answered to a leader, the journalist Eleuterio Fernandez Huidobro. Through the Tupamaros, he joined the guerrilla. They first had to illegally acquire weapons. During the presidential elections of 1966, they stole 63 rifles, in addition to pistols and uniforms. Did they combine their robberies with political propaganda? Certain acts, like leaking financial data from influential people and businesses, became legendary. This action was Pepe's favorite, as there was no need for violence. But the most memorable feat was the appropriation of a truck carrying groceries from a famous warehouse company. Instead of keeping the provisions, they left them to the inhabitants of a humble area of Montevideo. Within the Tupamaros, Mujica met Lucia Topolansky, a cultured young woman who also fought for what she believed was fair. The attraction between them was immediate, and a romantic relationship was born that would last for decades. The repercussions for the Tupamaros were immediate. The Uruguayan press was forbidden by the government from publishing articles about their actions. They were called the unmentionables. On the other hand, foreign media not only dedicated articles to them, they considered them anti-heroes. Without going any further, the New York Times defined them as the modern Robin Hoods. However, the Tupamaros remained unpopular in Uruguay. Mujica did not agree with being called guerrillas. Although he never denied guerrilla practices, he claimed armed struggle as his main form of fight. Even so, within a few years, he understood that the group was making mistakes. To start with, the inclusion of too many people. This would end up distorting the initial political vision to focus on kidnapping and murder. Their victims were police officers and businessmen, and they also attacked premises of companies like General Motors. At the same time, clashes with the police intensified, who had permission to suppress from President Jorge Pacheco Areco. A key year for Mujica and the Tupamaros was 1971. On one hand, it was one of the groups that made up the Broad Front, a left-wing political party that embraced democracy and progressivism while rejecting imperialism. But their performance in the presidential elections was not enough. The majority of the votes declared Juan Maria Bordaberry, a representative of the rural oligarchy who had the support of the United States Embassy and even the CIA, as the winner. Did the change of government harm Mujica and his companions? When Bordaberry became president, he aligned himself with the most conservative sectors and the military. The Tupamaros fought harder, but the new government was too much for them. In 1972, they were dismantled, and most of their leaders were killed or imprisoned. Among these were Mujica and Topolansky, although separately. It would be a long time before they saw each other again. The outlook for the future president and his group worsened even more. The coup d'etat they were so keen to avoid happened, and from the highest level of power. June 27, 1973. Bordaberry dissolved the parliament and political parties, revoked civil rights, and appointed military personnel to various government positions. By doing so, he set up a civic military dictatorship. For Mujica, it marked the start of a years-long nightmare. From the military dictatorship that began in Uruguay, Mujica and the rest of the detained Tupamaros came to be considered war trophies. If an attack with the Tupamaros seal were to occur again in the streets, they would be considered the authors and executed. More than prisoners, they were hostages. Along with Mujica were Huidobro, Raúl Sendic, Mauricio Rosenkopf, Julio Marenales, Jorge Manera, Adolfo Guasem, Jorge Zabalza, and Henry Engler. The conditions they had to endure were devastating. As an initial step, they were split into 3 groups of 3 and confined in unsanitary military unit cells. They never stayed in the same place. The confinement points were constantly changing. They were hooded and handcuffed and only had 1 bed. They even spent 2 years inside an underground well with no possibility of moving. They barely received something to eat. The jailers were forbidden to speak to them. They could only leave their cells once a day, which involved an operation with several soldiers. They only had that opportunity to see something from the outside and do their necessities. They were not allowed to go to the bathroom outside of that moment. When their bodies couldn't take it anymore, they had to figure out how to urinate or defecate inside the dungeon. Many times they used their own urine to quench their thirst. Mujica shared the prison with Huidobro and Rosenkopf. Despite isolation and humiliating conditions, they maintained hope and their fighting spirit. They encouraged each other and tried to stay active. In one of the cells, there were 7 small frogs that they adopted, feeding them with breadcrumbs. Pepe also acquired the habit of grabbing ants and putting them in his ear to listen to them. In addition, he missed reading. As he would remember, years later, he would spend 7 years without reading a book. He managed to get some newspaper pieces thrown at them to use as toilet paper, allowing him to learn about events happening outside. Over the years, some jailers unhappy with the dictatorship took some pity on them. They would give them some conversation and sometimes an egg or something else to eat. They also started receiving visits from loved ones. The few who came found emaciated, disheveled, dirty, smelly individuals with sunken cheekbones. Mujica's mother visited him and gave him a chamber pot. At first, the guards didn't want to allow him to have it, but he managed to convince them, and he took care of it like a treasure. Mujica and his companions endured 12 years in prison. But once, Pepe felt that he was losing control. He heard voices in his head and convinced himself that they were being recorded by the military. Overwhelmed by the sight of what he thought were antennas from the devices, he screamed for hours. But in recent years, conditions for him and his 2 companions began to improve due to inspections by representatives of international organizations. Thus, he could eat well, drink mate, and even write letters. But the end of the ordeal came in 1984 with the return of democracy. Thanks to a law, each year of captivity was worth 3 years of the original sentence. Thus, the 9 Tupamaros were released. As Mujica left his final assigned barracks, he took with him the pail he had turned into a flower pot. To his and his companions' surprise, they were greeted by family, friends, and a crowd of citizens who had never forgotten them. Pepe also reunited with Lucia Topolansky, his old girlfriend, who had also been released. Now in freedom, Mujica was able to resume his life. However, he had not lost the initiative to do something for the Uruguayans. Would he fully engage in politics? This time, armed with something more powerful than any revolver, shotgun, or bomb. Convictions. In the early years of Uruguayan democracy, Mujica rejoined the Broad Front. From there, along with Topolansky, he created another left-wing party, the Movement of Popular Participation, known by the acronym Movement of Popular Participation. His perseverance led him to be elected as a deputy for Montevideo and become a member of Uruguay's Chamber of Representatives, but he was unsatisfied. True to his honesty and Basque stubbornness, he said he felt like a vase. That did not stop him, and in the elections that took place 4 years later, he was elected senator. From his position, he was key in legalizing informal work and improving social security for farmers and urban workers. By the beginning of the 21st century, Mujica had become a political personality, unlike any other. His manners made him accessible, down-to-earth, without losing his intelligence and charisma. This was confirmed by the 2004 elections, in which he managed to get the Movement of Popular Participation the majority of votes and secured seats in the Senate. A year later, President Tabaré Vázquez appointed him as the Minister of Agriculture. As he gained more exposure, his influence became more recognizable to the public. Amidst his upward trajectory, Mujica didn't neglect his love life. In 2005, he married Topolansky, who also continued with a notable political career. This chain of achievements led him towards a greater goal, the presidency. His favorable qualities included his social calling and conciliatory nature. In this final case, he neared Argentina as tensions were high between the nations post-conflict, due to the installation of a cellulose plant in Fray Ventos. In fact, his candidacy for the Broad Front had the support of President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner and her husband, former President Néstor Kirchner. A key piece in this conflict with Uruguay, the support of foreign colleagues and compatriots, paid off. November 22, 2009. After a runoff with rival candidate Luis Alberto Lacalle, José Mujica was elected president of Uruguay. An event that began an incomparable stage in his life and in the country. Upon becoming president, Mujica made surprising decisions, starting with his lifestyle. Unlike other leaders, he chose not to live in the government house. He disliked having to move through several floors and having servants, so he preferred to stay at his farm Rincón del Cerro, where he felt comfortable. Would you define yourself as a neo-stoic? This attitude amazed every corner of the planet. No authority gave up the luxuries of power. Because of this attitude, Mujica became known as the most austere president. He was even called the poor president. But his simple lifestyle didn't stop him from fulfilling his presidential duties. His priority was to achieve social equality. In 2013, Uruguay passed the equal marriage law, becoming the second Latin American country to do so after Argentina. Around this time, he also promoted the Plan Juntos, aimed at helping needy families, especially poor women, heads of households, so that they could raise their children under better conditions. He also enhanced the equity plan that benefited families with children in vulnerable situations. Mujica also focused on industrial and economic matters. Significant investments in agriculture made Uruguay a major food exporter. Meanwhile, Uruguay legalized the production and consumption of cannabis, an unprecedented move globally. Although Mujica's achievements were clear and praised, he also made controversial decisions. As a promoter of dialogue to resolve conflicts, he strengthened ties with his Latin American peers. He was convinced that revenge led to nothing. That's why he maintained that it was enough to disagree with the other's ideas. He believed this was the only way to restore trust in the country. He tried to include all the other leaders in his eagerness to cultivate a life less based on consumerism and more on the human aspect, to take care of the environment for the future. But many wondered what the president's attitude would be towards human rights, more specifically regarding the Uruguayan military dictatorship. Before his government, Vázquez had started the search for the disappeared, while Bordaberry was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Mujica acknowledged the state's responsibility for the crimes of that era and wanted to give a new impetus to the search for the remains of the disappeared. Attempts were made to get some kind of guidance from high-ranking military officers who should have indispensable information, but all refused to cooperate. The little help came from relatives and some soldiers. Mujica always felt that was one of his great failures. On the other hand, in 2011 he sought to nullify the law of expiration of the state's punitive claim, which since 1986 prevents the trial of military and police for human rights violations committed during the dictatorship. He never achieved it. Beyond what could not be, Mujica generated a closeness with his people and awakened international trust. When his term ended in 2015, he left a positive image, something not very common in a president with a lower profile. But as always, Mujica moved on to occupy a space in the Senate. However, this new stage in his life would be marked by new and terrible adversities. Prior to his presidency, Mujica faced health issues. In 2004, he was diagnosed with an unspecified autoimmune disease that required him to follow a dietary regimen. The care allowed Mujica to be well for years, including his time as a leader. That's why he wasn't allowed to make too many trips abroad. But in 2017, he suffered a digestive condition and was hospitalized for 36 hours for various tests. Although the test results were positive, it was still impossible to identify the illness that was afflicting him. One thing was certain, he needed to take better care of himself, especially as he aged. He managed to recover, although with stricter care. In 2019 at an event, a woman approached him for a kiss. He stopped her very politely and explained that he could not reciprocate that gesture of affection as he suffered from an immunological disease. Mujica's situation became more delicate in 2020 with the outbreak of the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic. Due to his senatorial duties requiring him to be active and travel, he had to retire from politics. He did so reluctantly and feeling indebted for all that he could still have done. Simultaneously, he knew he was a man from a different era, out of place in the new age. He believed veteran politicians should step down to allow new generations to take their place. When the pandemic ended, Mujica dedicated himself to popular activism and continued to take care of himself. For a while, his health was not a headline topic until he announced that he had cancer. And that brings our story full circle. After the announcement of the interview, Mujica withdrew from public life, gave no more notes, and took refuge in his farm with Topolansky. Just over 4 months after he expressed that he had come this far, he left. He was 89 years old. In his later years, Pepe Mujica defined himself as an old man with a few years of gunshot prison on his back, who tried to be consistent with what he thought every day of the year and every year of his life. Thus, he showed that it was possible to be true to oneself, even behind bars, even having reached the presidency of a country. When he felt that he could not do everything he set out to do, his policy set precedents in Uruguay. To begin with, he achieved much of his goal of helping the most needy. His authenticity and work ethic earned him awards and recognition at home and abroad, but above all, he gained the admiration of the people and the respect of the dissidents. From his beginnings in the 60s, his figure transcended the realm of politics to become part of popular culture. Unlike other presidents who provoked rejection or hatred, he inspired artistic works that exalted his values. In the 90s, his first biography, Mujica, was written by Miguel Ángel Campodónico. He was also not foreign to cinema. Serbian director Emir Kusturica made a documentary about his life, El Pepe, A Supreme Life. In fact, Kusturica considered him the last hero of politics. Furthermore, his sufferings as a hostage of the dictatorship gave rise to the Uruguayan film The Night of the 12 Years, based on the book Memories from the Dungeon, signed by Uy, Dobro, and Rosenkopf. Spanish actor Antonio de la Torre portrayed Mujica. Several of his speeches were used in music albums by various artists. Even when the world plunges into an abyss, Pepe Mujica will always stand out as a beacon and remind us of the importance of unwavering humanism. Thank you for watching the video.